it appears that emails from Whitehall officials obtained by The Athletic have given insight into the type of pressure put on the Premier League to allow Newcastle United's takeover by Saudi Arabia's Public Investment Fund. The emails show that the blocking of the takeover was seen as, quotes, an immediate risk by the officials. The government emails have been obtained by The Athletic, and one states this letter seeks to encourage early senior level engagement with Saudi Arabia. Newcastle is the immediate risk. And then it went on, the Premier League declined to comment, but has always insisted the government had no influence on the takeover. It doesn't sound like it, does it?
Well, we know as a matter of course that Mohammed bin Salman, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, had written to Boris Johnson and asked him to intervene and suggest that this was problematic given the nature of the commercial relationship, which is we supply bombs to Saudi Arabia to drop on Yemen. So with that in mind, there was always a background noise given the nature of the relationship between these two countries. Obviously, a lot of the text messages that we've seen are redacted, so we don't get the full extent of what people are saying.
True.
And it's not surprising that you've got, SPADs involved, special advisors involved, trying to create currency around what they may or may not be able to add value to. Whether this created any influence, whether the government had any actual consequence or benefit from the things that they were alluding amongst themselves is a different discussion.
Well, be honest with me here, Simon. Look at it. Do you personally believe, and I do, the government lent on this? And lent on the Premier League.
Well, let's think about it. If you can believe that the government lent on the All England club to ban Russian players from playing in Wimbledon last year, why is it beyond the realms of possibility they would have lent into the Premier League and suggested that this might need to be looked at in a favourable way?
The Premier League's meant to be independent, isn't it?
But the problem is this: none of this is relevant because there's no reason. There was never any reason why Newcastle United couldn't be bought by the PIF fund. Never any reason. There's no rules in place that stops a nation state from buying a football club. And all this subterfuge and all this misdirection is just rubbish. It was all about piracy. And the Premier League, when the Premier League were able to get away from the piracy issue, i.e. when they copped to it, when the Saudis copped to the piracy that happened on their shores via BeIN and paid BeIN £1 billion, miraculously, this deal can be now done. But I take your point, which is we should not be having these politicians, but they're everywhere. I mean, the DCMS will tell you that we need to listen to the issues that happened at Yorkshire County Cricket Club. So where's the influence there?
True.
There is the bottom line is that sport and politics, or sport and politicians, will always be bedfellows because there's a leverage in there. Don't you remember a few years ago the Labour Party were putting in their manifesto that every time a football club gets sold, 10% of of that club should be given or be able to be bought by the fans. Okay then, so next time Man United sold for £5 billion, 10%, the fans are going to pony up £500 million, are they, to buy 10%? Because it positions the politicians in a certain way, but it is not where we want it to be, certainly.
So we shouldn't really feel too surprised if indeed the government emails were fired off to the Premier League. Entertain this. I mean, look at it. They say football is prestigious in the Gulf and popular amongst Saudi Arabia's youthful population. Yeah, sure. Do this. You can see it happening.
But that's fine.
And it raises another question about a government's ability to execute a regulator for football in this country who is truly independent.
But it's not. The independent regulator is not independent because it's independent of political influence. Lose the term independent as far as political allegiances and understand the term independent in terms of football positioning. The independent regulator is not aligned to any governing body. It's not part of the football fraternity. It's an independent regulator, independent of the EFL, independent of the FA, independent of the PFA, independent of all the bodies. That's its role as an independent regulator. It would be silly to suggest that a regulator appointed by government doesn't have a degree of allegiance to government. That's why regulators are put in place. Ofgem.
No, but the regulators should come in for the best interests of football, not the best interests of the government.
No, but no one's suggesting it's coming in for the best interests of the government. You're questioning the terminology independent and suggesting it should be independent of political leanings.
This situation is.
No, hold on. You're suggesting that the government wants to turn to the Sport Premier League and say, we'd like to look at this. Now, what the Premier League do, Premier League can turn around quite easily and turn around and say, how about you mind your own bleeding business? This has got nothing to do with you. And who knows, that's maybe what they did. But if you don't believe that conversations happen between influential people in one sphere and influential people in another, then we all need to grow up a little bit. The fact is, the matter is, the Premier League has a choice. The government can't sanction them. The government can't do anything to the Premier League. They can't make their life difficult. They're a huge contributor to the exchequer. The government wants a profitable English football league.
But Simon, you can second guess this. You know much more about this than me. The government lent in the Premier League, it would seem, because the government needed something out of this.
No. What we're doing, because it suits our narrative, is we're seeing
Saudi investment.
What we're doing? Well, Saudi investment
into this economy.
Well, you're sitting on Twitter, and everybody uses Saudi's own part of Twitter. You go to a hotel in London, like the Savoy, the Saudis own that particular hotel. Do we stop going into these spaces because ultimately the Saudi investment? But go to the point that we don't know. These are internal correspondences going on between government officials and SPADs. And it doesn't necessarily mean that they found themselves into the ear and eyes of Richard Masters. Now, I would suspect there might have been conversations had, but Richard Masters, but again, it's a leap. It is a leap, and not an unreasonable leap to make, but it's a leap notwithstanding it, to say, well, actually, the reasons why they made this go through. But it's not that. And everyone needs to get the scales off their bleeding eyes. This was a nation state that can buy a football club because there's no rules from stopping them from doing it in European football, because we've seen the Qataris do it at PSG. And the only reason Newcastle was stopped from being bought by the Saudis is because they were allowing piracy of Premier League rights in Saudi Arabia. The moment they stopped doing it, oh, lo and behold, all of a sudden you can buy the football club. And by the way, let's put up a little smoke screen to get rid of the human rights guys by saying there's a wall between the sovereign fund and the state. Nonsense.
Like, if we break it down and look at it for what it appears to be, the government decided to get involved and lobbied the Premier League and said, we could do with you that, given this the green light.
Maybe, but we don't see any evidence of that because we haven't got the other side of the argument. We don't know whether that contact went from a discussion in WhatsApp
what were the
groups.
emails about from the government to the Premier League if they weren't about that?
Well, are they to the Premier League, or are they between themselves, suggesting they need to talk to the Premier League?
One email, this letter seeks to encourage early senior level engagement with Saudi Arabia.
Okay, but is that...
What does that tell you that they tried to do?
Internally between...
Do us a favour, talk to the Saudis, get this done.
Is that... Okay, I question you not for the point of being argumentative with you, but is that because there's an internal discussion between government advisors about how they approach the Premier League, or is that because the Premier League are being approached by the government advisors?
It's because the government wanted, in every which way they could, to encourage the Premier League to get this through, because the government overall wants Saudi investment in this country.
I'm not being difficult, but the government wants any kind of investment in anything. They're going to sell the London Stock Exchange recently.
This was super sensitive because it was Saudi Arabia.
But why is it? We're a globalised world. Why is it? And I'll tell you why it is.
Because in the longer term, it would look like Saudi owning a Premier League club, which it still looks like.
But the greatest respect in the world, why aren't we taking umbrage of all the other things that they own in this country?
But why don't you just address this?
I'm addressing it.
Only this?
I'm addressing it because...
Not about everything else, the Savoy or whatever.
But we can't choose what we're outraged by, can we? We can't simply go, well, I'll tell you what, I'm not outraged by going into that space because it suits me to, but I am outraged going in this space. The bottom line is that if we believe that the government created undue influence on the Premier League, then we're living in Narnia. The Premier League had no right to stop them buying this football club. They had no legal basis for it.
But was it right that the government got involved in any event?
If indeed the government, if we're amateurish enough to think the government doesn't have confidence, we've just seen it. We've seen the government lean on the All England club. We've seen it. Now that's that's the nature of the beast. But we don't have, what we have is internal correspondence. And I'm not defending this motley group impersonating a government in any shape or form. But the bottom line is we're seeing internal advisors discussing it amongst themselves, and likely they might have had a conversation with the Premier League. But here's the pushback from us. Why do we assume that the Premier League didn't turn around and say, thank you very much, we note your opinion, because they are allowed to have an opinion. We're allowed to have an opinion about it, so are the government. We note your opinion, but we'll do what we want. And if you believe that subsequently...
Do you think the Premier League did that?
Well, I think the only reason... Well, they did it for a bloody long time, didn't they? And the only... Isn't it funny on the day that the Saudis cop to piracy, the deal can go through?
Yeah. But why
everybody with half a brain knew what it was.
In this, the Premier League declined to comment about this alleged government intervention, but has always insisted the government had no influence on the takeover. Why is the Premier League declining to comment? Why don't they just come out and say,
because they already have.
As to your interest in this story, no, we didn't let the government lean on us at all.
They've declined to... They made an observation historically. They don't feel the need to rehash it just because we've found some additional evidence that might support the argument that we want to advance. They've commented on it. They don't need to add to it. We think they do because we want it top and tailed, so we can pull the bones out of it and look at it again and see, well, that didn't quite chime with what that was over there. But the point of the matter is that the only reason The only reason this takeover happened is not because the government lent on the Premier League and the Premier League subsequently acquiesced to a political persuasion because we've got currency, we've got deals with the Saudis, was because they couldn't stop them. And the only reason they could stop them was because of piracy. And the moment piracy was removed from the equation,
I accept
that's
that.
it.
But
that's
a simple question to round this off. In any event, should the government be pressurising the Premier League over a takeover of any club?
Okay, well, let me ask you a question again. Does asking somebody a question...
Should they? Answer that for me.
But is it pressure or is it...
Of course it's pressure.
Or is it pressure?
Why did the emails start coming in?
You've got no jurisdiction. Do you concede that the government have got no jurisdiction over the Premier League?
They have influence over the Premier League and its decision-making, surely.
How? On what basis?
This is evidence of it.
Okay, well, let me give you an example. The Premier League were told by the government to pony up some money for the EFL during COVID. And what did they do? Nothing. They gave them nothing. So where's the influence?
Jim White and Simon Jordan. Monday to Friday mornings from 10 on AM, on DAB, via the talkSPORT app and on your smart speaker. talkSPORT.